The moment he fired me, I felt like the ground vanished beneath my feet. It happened so suddenly, so brutally, that for a few seconds I wasn't even sure if I had heard him correctly. One moment I was standing in the conference room, clutching a notepad filled with the meticulous details I had stayed up all night preparing. And the next moment his voice cut through the room like a blade, sharp and final. "You're done here," he said, his tone cold, dismissive, and laced with the arrogance of a man who believed his word was law. The silence that followed was deafening, every eye in the room turning toward me, some in pity, others in amusement, as if I were a spectacle rather than a human being. My name is not important, at least not in this moment, because back then I was just the assistant. That was my identity. The invisible hand that kept the machinery of his empire running, the quiet figure who organized his calendar, drafted his reports, prepped him for investor meetings, and sometimes even stayed behind long after he had gone home to make sure his world looked perfect the next day. I was the kind of assistant who went beyond duty, not because I was forced to, but because I believed that hard work, loyalty, and dedication would eventually be recognized. For 3 years, I gave that company everything I had: my time, my energy, my creativity, and even my health. I carried his burdens as if they were mine. I shielded him from mistakes before they could embarrass him, and I took pride in being the person he could rely on, even when no one else could stand his temper. But power does strange things to men like him. The CEO was brilliant, yes, but his brilliance came coated with poison. He had a temper that flared without warning, an ego that demanded worship, and an arrogance that blinded him to the worth of those around him. He thrived on control, on making people squirm under the weight of his authority, and in his mind, assistants were disposable tools, not human beings with dignity. I had seen him belittle employees before, an intern reduced to tears, a manager storming out after being humiliated in front of the board. But I never thought the day would come when I would be on the receiving end of that same cruelty. That morning, I had arrived earlier than anyone else, as usual. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy with expectation, and I remember staring at the city skyline from the 32nd floor, thinking about how far I had come from my modest beginnings. I carried a worn bag, inside of which were neatly organized folders, a laptop with half its keys faded from overuse, and a planner marked with color-coded tabs for every task, every deadline, every investor he needed to impress. I took pride in being prepared, in being the person who anticipated problems before they existed. It gave me a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging in a world that often told me I wasn't enough. By the time the conference room filled with executives and staff, I was already seated quietly in the corner, ready to take notes, ready to manage the chaos. He walked in late, as he often did, with his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his hair slicked back, and his eyes scanning the room like a predator sizing up prey. There was a hush as he sat down, and for a moment, everything felt normal. He began asking questions about the presentation slides, the numbers, the growth strategies, and I was ready, flipping through my notes to provide him with answers whenever he needed them. But then, something shifted. He asked for a file, one I had actually placed on his desk the night before, highlighted and tabbed. When he couldn't find it, his irritation grew, his voice sharp as he demanded to know why I hadn't done my job. I explained calmly that it was in his office, exactly where I had left it. But he didn't care. His anger wasn't about the file. It was about control. It was about showing everyone in that room who held the power. He leaned back, his voice rising so that everyone could hear, and he said the words that still echo in my memory. "You're incompetent. You're a liability. You're fired." There was a stunned silence. My pen slipped from my fingers and hit the table with a soft clatter that felt louder than thunder. My chest tightened, my throat constricted, and for a few seconds, I felt as if I couldn't breathe. My legs trembled beneath me, but I forced myself to stay standing, even as humiliation washed over me in waves. I looked around the room and saw the faces of people I had worked beside for years. Some avoided my eyes, others looked away in discomfort, and a few smirked, as if they were glad it wasn't them this time. That's how fear worked in that office. Everyone knew that one wrong move could put them in my position, yet instead of solidarity, there was only silence. The worst part wasn't the firing itself. It was the way he did it. He didn't pull me aside, didn't give me a chance to defend myself, didn't show me even the smallest shred of respect for the years I had given. He made me a public example, a warning to anyone else who dared to question him or fail to meet his impossible standards. His words weren't just meant to end my employment. They were meant to shatter my dignity. And for a moment, they did. As I gathered my things, my hands shaking, I heard the whispers begin to spread through the room. Some people whispered about how harsh he had been. Others speculated about what I had done wrong. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the burning humiliation I felt as I walked past them. My head held high, only because I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. My chest ached, my stomach churned, and every step felt like it was made of lead. When I finally pushed through the glass doors of the office, the city outside looked different. Colder, sharper, as if it too had turned its back. On me. I remember sitting on the edge of a fountain across the street, clutching my worn bag against my chest, and staring at the water as it shimmered in the sunlight. People walked by without noticing me. Just another face in the crowd. Just another story of failure in a city that thrived on ambition. I wanted to cry, to scream, to ask why years of loyalty had ended in such cruelty. But the tears refused to come. Instead, there was only a heavy silence inside me, the kind that feels like the end of something you can't ever get back. For hours, I sat there, replaying the moment in my head, each word cutting deeper, each glance of pity or mockery from the others replaying like a cruel loop. I thought of my rent, my bills, my empty savings account, and fear clawed at me with sharp nails. How would I survive? How would I start over? And yet, beneath the fear, something else began to stir. A faint ember of anger, of defiance, of something that whispered that this wasn't the end. Because while he thought he had broken me, what he didn't know was that I carried something far more powerful than his arrogance. I carried knowledge. I carried memories of every meeting, every investor conversation, every weakness in his empire that he thought no one else noticed. I carried the truth of who he really was, and I knew, deep down, that truth had a way of coming back to haunt men like him. But in that moment, as the sun dipped lower in the sky and the city lights began to flicker awake, all I knew was this: I had been fired, humiliated, discarded like I was nothing. And yet, a voice inside me whispered that this was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning. But what he thought was my end was only the beginning of his downfall. You never really know someone until you've worked behind their closed doors. From the outside, he was everything the world believed a successful CEO should be: polished, confident, commanding, and always one step ahead of the competition. To the board, he was a visionary. To the press, he was a genius. To investors, he was a golden ticket to endless returns. But to me, the person who sat just beyond the glass wall of his corner office, who managed his calls and whispered reminders during meetings, he was something else entirely. He was a man built on arrogance, held together by greed, and weakened by insecurities he worked tirelessly to hide. The first time I truly saw his mask slip was on a late night when the office was nearly empty. Everyone else had gone home. The cleaners had already started their rounds, and only the hum of the city below kept us company. He sat at his desk with his tie loosened, his face flushed with anger, slamming the phone down so hard I thought the glass would shatter. He had just gotten off a call with an investor who dared to question his strategy, and for the next 20 minutes, I listened to him pace the room, muttering insults under his breath, mocking the very people who funded his empire. "They think they know better than me," he snarled, his voice low but laced with venom. "They wouldn't last a day without me." That was the real him, the man no magazine profile ever captured. Behind closed doors, he was impatient, cruel, and ruthless in ways that weren't about strength, but about fear. He hated being questioned, despised being challenged, and would lash out at anyone who dared to poke holes in his perfect image. Working so close to him, I became both a witness and a shield. I absorbed his tempers, his late-night demands, and his careless insults because that was what the job required. Or at least, that's what I told myself at the time. There were days when the pressure felt unbearable. He thrived on control, and that control extended to every person in the building. Emails sent at midnight came with the expectation of immediate answers. Mistakes, no matter how small, were punished with public humiliation. I had seen managers with decades of experience reduced to stammering apologies in front of the team, their faces burning with shame as he cut them down with words sharper than knives. The fear was constant, like a thick fog that hung over the office. People learned to survive by staying silent, by never drawing too much attention, by always keeping their heads down. For me, silence wasn't an option. As his assistant, I was in his line of fire every day. If a meeting was scheduled 5 minutes late, it was my fault. If an investor didn't show, it was my mistake. If he lost his temper in a negotiation, I became the scapegoat. And yet, I endured it. I told myself it was temporary, that learning from someone so powerful would eventually pay off. But each insult, each long night where I sat in the glow of my computer screen while he dictated notes at 2 a.m, each time he dismissed my efforts as if they were nothing. All of it chipped away at my sense of worth. Still, enduring gave me something I didn't realize at the time: knowledge. Because while he shouted, I listened. While he mocked his investors, I memorized their names, their concerns, their hesitations. While he bragged about deals in the works, I noticed the gaps in his plans, the numbers that didn't add up, the overconfidence that blinded him to reality. I learned who trusted him blindly and who was already questioning his leadership. I learned which clients were close to walking away, which contracts were weaker than they appeared, and which investors were one bad quarter away from pulling their money. The irony was that he thought I was invisible. He thought I was just a servant to his ambition, someone who would forever remain in his shadow. He never realized that the shadow is where you see the cracks most clearly. Every slammed phone call, every outburst, every whispered frustration became a piece of a puzzle I didn't even know I was putting together. By the time he fired me, I carried inside me a map of his empire, complete, with its weaknesses and blind spots. There's one memory that stands out more than the others, a night that revealed just how deep his greed ran. We were preparing for a massive investor meeting, one that would determine whether millions of dollars in funding would continue to flow into the company. He sat at his desk, rehearsing his speech, while I handed him updated reports. At one point, he leaned back, smirked, and said, "They don't need the truth, they need the illusion. As long as I keep them dazzled, they'll write the checks." He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made my stomach twist. That was his philosophy in a single sentence: illusion over integrity, greed over growth. It was in moments like that when I realized he didn't respect anyone, not even the people who trusted him with their fortunes. He saw investors as pawns, employees as tools, and competitors as obstacles to be crushed. He believed himself untouchable, too important to fall, too brilliant to be questioned. But I knew better. I had seen the late-night panic when deals slipped through his fingers, the quiet desperation when numbers didn't align, the thin cracks in the empire he built on arrogance. Those cracks stayed with me long after I was fired. They haunted me in the quiet hours of the night, whispering that the man who humiliated me was not as invincible as he wanted the world to believe. For years, I had carried those secrets silently, unsure of what they meant or what I could ever do with them. But as I sat in the aftermath of losing my job, broken and humiliated, I realized something I hadn't before. Knowledge is power. And I had far more of it than he ever imagined. Because I wasn't just an assistant. I was a witness to his empire. I was the keeper of his flaws. I was the one who knew the difference between the mask he showed the world and the face he wore behind closed doors. And while he thought firing me had rid him of a problem, he had unknowingly set loose the one person who carried the truth of his weaknesses. That truth was heavy, yes, but it was also sharp, waiting to be used. And as I pieced together everything I knew, every arrogance, every cruelty, every hidden crack in his business, I began to see a path forward, one I never could have imagined before. And those secrets became the very weapon he never expected me to use. Sometimes the worst day of your life becomes the fire that reshapes you. In the days that followed my firing, I discovered what it meant to fall to the very bottom of yourself, to face a version of life so raw, so merciless, that every illusion of safety you once carried was stripped away. When he fired me, he didn't just take away a paycheck. He took away the identity I had built around being useful. The fragile pride I had found in being the person who could hold everything together. Overnight, I went from the assistant who knew every secret of the company to a discarded nobody, invisible in a city that moves too fast to notice broken people sitting on its sidewalks. The loneliness hit first. For 3 years, my life had been consumed by that office. Every morning began with the buzz of my phone. Every night ended with the glow of my laptop screen, and every conversation seemed to revolve around his world, his meetings, his plans, his temper. Suddenly, all of it was gone. My phone went silent. My calendar emptied. The people I once called colleagues stopped answering my messages, afraid, perhaps, that associating with me would put them on his radar. The silence was deafening. The kind that makes every hour feel like an echo chamber of your own failures. I remember lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator as if it were mocking me, reminding me that my world had been reduced to this, quiet, lonely, and directionless. Then came the fear. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind that creeps in quietly, tightening its grip a little more each day. I had rent due in 2 weeks, bills stacked on the kitchen counter, and barely enough savings to last the month. I ran numbers in my head late into the night, trying to stretch dollars that refused to stretch any further. Each grocery trip became a calculation. Each bus ride a reminder that I could not afford mistakes anymore. Fear is not always the roar of panic. It is often the whisper that follows you into bed and greets you again when you wake. A constant reminder that you are only a few steps away from losing everything. And then, as if loneliness and fear weren't enough, shame came crashing in. Shame has a way of sinking deeper than any insult. People I thought were friends began to distance themselves, not out of cruelty, but because failure is uncomfortable to witness. In hushed tones, I knew they whispered about me. I had been fired publicly, after all. Stories like mine travel fast in offices where gossip is a currency. Some said I must have made a terrible mistake. Others suggested I was never competent enough to begin with. I heard one former co-worker laugh as she recounted the way he dismissed me, describing my silence as if it were proof of weakness. Every word burned, not because I believed them, but because I couldn't shake the image of myself through their eyes, discarded, irrelevant, and small. I tried to hide it, to put on a brave face when I bumped into familiar people in the neighborhood. I would force a smile, pretend I was exploring new opportunities, even though inside I was breaking. But you can't fake confidence when you're carrying shame. It shows in the slump of your shoulders, in the way your eyes avoid others, in the half-hearted tone of your voice. I felt exposed all the time, like everyone could see the failure clinging to me like a stain I couldn't wash out. And perhaps the cruelest part was how quickly the world forgot me. I had given 3 years of my life to that company, and within a week, it was as though I had never existed at all. Rock bottom is not just a place. It is a season. It is nights where hunger keeps you awake because you don't want to waste the little food you have. It is mornings where you stare at your resume, but cannot bring yourself to send it out because rejection feels inevitable. It is walking past the office building where you once belonged and feeling the sting of invisibility, as though the walls themselves have erased your name. There were nights when I sat in darkness, lights turned off to save on the electricity bill, the city's glow leaking in through the blinds, and I wondered if this was all life would ever be. Surviving, shrinking, disappearing. But somewhere in the pit of that despair, something else stirred. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a small ember glowing faintly in ashes. At first it was just anger, the raw, unshaped anger of being discarded like I was nothing. I replayed his words, his mocking tone, his arrogance as he stripped me of my dignity in front of everyone, and with each replay, the ember grew hotter. Yet anger alone cannot sustain you. It must transform into something else. And slowly, it did. That ember became a question. What if this wasn't the end? What if everything I had endured, the late nights, the humiliations, the knowledge I carried, could be turned into something greater? The idea was fragile at first, like a whisper I didn't trust enough to speak aloud. But it kept returning, persistent, stubborn, like a seed pushing through cracked pavement. Because deep down, I knew something he didn't. I knew his flaws, I knew his weaknesses, I knew the cracks in the empire he guarded so fiercely. And the more I thought about it, the more that idea grew, until it began to take shape, not just as a fantasy of revenge, but as the possibility of rewriting my story. But in that darkness, an idea began to take root. When life burns you down, you either turn to ashes or steel. After weeks of drowning in silence, fear, and shame, I found myself standing at a crossroads I never imagined I would face. On one side was surrender, the slow acceptance that my life had peaked in that corner office as an assistant to a powerful man, that from here on out I would drift through survival jobs, quietly forgotten by the world. On the other side was something more dangerous, the choice to rise, to take the pain that had scorched me and let it forge me into something unbreakable. For a long time, I lingered between the two, terrified of failure, but unable to silence the ember that had begun to glow inside me. Courage does not arrive with fanfare. It creeps in quietly, disguised as defiance. Mine came one night as I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of crumpled bills in front of me, my bank account nearly empty, and the mocking echoes of his voice still burning in my memory. As I traced the numbers with my finger, panic gripping my chest, I suddenly heard another voice, softer but stronger. The voice of reason, of memory, of all the late nights I had spent doing far more than what my title required. For 3 years, I had been more than an assistant. I had been a builder, an architect working in the shadows. The CEO thrived on public credit, but the reality was that much of his empire had been held together by invisible hands. My hands. I was the one who drafted the investor reports he paraded as his own brilliance. I was the one who organized data, connected the dots, and smoothed over details that would have otherwise exposed cracks in his strategies. I was the one who remembered investors' children's birthdays, who followed up on casual comments they made during lunches, who sent thank you notes that deepened trust when his arrogance had nearly destroyed it. He gave orders, yes, but I turned those orders into reality, filling in gaps with my own ideas, improvisations, and foresight. Without realizing it, I had been building a machine far larger than my paycheck reflected. The more I thought about it, the more furious I became. Not just at him, but at myself. How had I missed it? How had I not seen that I was the one propping him up, the one ensuring his empire didn't collapse under the weight of his ego? I had believed I was powerless, when in truth, I was the one holding power the entire time. The arrogance that blinded him had blinded me too, convincing me that my worth was tied only to his approval. Now, stripped of his shadow, I began to see clearly for the first time. I remembered the countless nights I had stayed after everyone else had gone home, poring over contracts he barely glanced at. I remembered the meetings where I scribbled notes faster than he could speak, later turning his half-formed ideas into structured plans. I remembered the weekends when I sifted through financial statements to flag red numbers he ignored, quietly drafting solutions before anyone else noticed the risks. Piece by piece, I realized I wasn't just a bystander to his success. I had been part of the foundation itself. And then came the most startling realization of all. I knew his investors better than he did. I knew their fears, their desires, the quiet doubts they never voiced to him, but whispered to me in passing. I had been the bridge between his arrogance and their patience, smoothing over the damage his temper caused, reassuring them when his decisions rattled their confidence. I remembered the way one investor had confided in me during a late dinner, saying, "Sometimes I think you care more about this company than he does." At the time, I had laughed it off, embarrassed by the compliment, but now those words returned to me like a revelation. They trusted me, not because of a title, but because I listened, I remembered, and I treated them with the respect he never bothered to give. That night, as I sat in the dim glow of my apartment, surrounded by the silence that had once suffocated me, I felt something shift deep inside. The ember of anger had transformed into fire, and with it came clarity. I was not powerless. I had never been powerless. I carried knowledge, relationships, and insight that no one could take from me, not even him. And for the first time since that humiliating day, I felt something I thought I had lost forever. Hope. But hope, I knew, was not enough on its own. If I wanted to rise, I would have to act. I would have to step into a world where I had always been told I didn't belong and prove that I was more than the label of assistant. It would mean risking rejection, risking humiliation all over again, but this time on my own terms. As the thought solidified, I felt both terrified and exhilarated. The same hands that had once scribbled notes in silence now trembled with the possibility of writing a new story. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the cracked ceiling of my apartment, and whispered to myself words I had never dared to believe before. You know this business better than he does. You always did. And that realization pushed me to make a decision that could change everything. Power doesn't collapse when enemies attack. It collapses when allies stop believing. I had spent years at his side, and in that time I saw firsthand how fragile loyalty truly was. On the surface, his empire looked unshakable. Investors lined up to throw money at his ventures. The board applauded his speeches, and the press wrote articles calling him a genius. But when you work close enough to someone like him, you begin to hear the cracks forming long before anyone else notices. They don't start with explosions. They start with whispers. The first whisper I overheard was at a dinner party, months before he fired me. He had stepped away to take a phone call, leaving me to pour drinks for 2 investors seated nearby. They didn't realize I was close enough to hear, or perhaps they thought an assistant was as invisible as the wallpaper. One of them leaned closer and muttered, "His numbers look good, but he's burning cash too fast. If he keeps this up, we'll be underwater by next quarter." The other sighed, swirling the wine in his glass. "He's reckless. He thinks confidence will hide the risks. It won't." Their words stayed with me long after the night ended, like a secret I wasn't supposed to carry. Over time, I began to collect more of these whispers. a raised eyebrow when he exaggerated growth statistics, a frustrated sigh when he dismissed genuine concerns. Investors who once praised his boldness began to grow tired of his arrogance. At first, it was subtle. Shorter applause at board meetings, polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes, late replies to his emails. But when you pay attention, you notice these small shifts. They were signals, tiny red flags waving in the wind, warning that his support system wasn't as strong as he believed. I saw it in the financials too. One evening, while compiling a quarterly report, I noticed the numbers didn't match the glossy picture he planned to present. Expenses were climbing, profits shrinking, and yet he insisted on projecting aggressive growth. When I quietly pointed it out, he waved me off with a dismissive laugh. "Perception matters more than reality," he said, his eyes gleaming with the kind of arrogance that mistakes illusion for invincibility. But reality has a way of catching up, and the investors were beginning to sense it. There was another night, long past midnight, when I stayed behind to organize contracts. Through the half-open conference room door, I overheard two board members speaking in hushed tones. One said, "If he doesn't change course soon, we'll have to intervene." The other replied, "He won't listen. He never listens. His ego won't let him." I remember freezing in the hallway, the weight of their words pressing against me. These weren't critics from the outside. These were his own allies, men who had once defended him with blind loyalty. And now, even they were questioning how much longer they could stand by him. The subtle signs were everywhere once I knew how to look. Investors who once rushed to take his calls began sending assistants in their place. Some declined invitations to his lavish dinners, citing scheduling conflicts that didn't ring true. I watched as one long-time partner walked out of a meeting with clenched fists and muttered under his breath, "He's lost it." Even his most loyal supporters were beginning to doubt, though none dared to say it to his face. The irony was that he didn't notice any of it. He was too blinded by his own ego, too intoxicated by the illusion of power. He mistook silence for loyalty, and polite nods for agreement. He believed his empire was as strong as ever, but I knew better. I had been in the rooms where doubts bloomed like cracks in the foundation. I had heard the tone in their voices, the unease in their laughter, the hesitation in their signatures. It was all there, if you listened closely enough. And I did listen. I listened to every whisper, every doubt, every sigh of frustration. I collected them like puzzle pieces, storing them in the back of my mind, unsure of when or how I would ever use them. But now, standing at the lowest point of my life, I realized those whispers were more than just gossip. They were opportunities. They were proof that even the powerful man who had humiliated me wasn't untouchable. His allies were no longer unshakable pillars. They were leaning, fragile, waiting for someone to push. It struck me then that I had something he didn't. He had power, money, and a stage. But I had the truth. I had the memory of every doubt spoken behind closed doors, every flaw hidden in the numbers, every investor who rolled their eyes after one of his arrogant speeches. He might have thought I was invisible, but being invisible meant I saw everything he missed. And in those whispers, I found the seeds of a plan. I couldn't confront him head-on. Not yet. He still had too much influence, too much bravado to be shaken by my words alone. But his investors, those were different. They were already doubting him, already wondering if they had tied their fortunes to the wrong man. They needed a voice, someone who could show them they weren't alone in their concerns. And I realized, with a shock that sent a thrill through my chest, that the voice could be mine. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the whispers replayed in my mind, louder now, clearer, as if the universe itself had been preparing me all along. I saw the cracks forming into fractures, fractures that could break open with the right pressure. For the first time since I had been fired, I didn't feel powerless, I felt dangerous, because I knew what he didn't. The fortress he thought was built of stone was already crumbling, and I held the map of every weak spot. And I knew exactly how to use that doubt in my favor. My hands shook as I reached out to the very people who once trusted him. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into the unknown, knowing one wrong step could shatter what little hope I had left. These were not just business contacts. These were powerful investors, people who controlled millions, sometimes billions of dollars, men and women who lived in skyscrapers of glass and steel, whose decisions could change the direction of companies overnight. For years, I had only been the assistant, the one who poured their coffee, scheduled their flights, and sent polite thank you notes on behalf of my boss. And now here I was, about to reach out to them not as his assistant, but as myself. The fear was suffocating. I imagined their laughter if they saw my name pop up in their inbox. I could hear them saying, "Isn't this the kid who used to fetch files? What makes him think he belongs in this conversation?" Worse than laughter, I feared silence, being ignored, being dismissed as irrelevant. Because in the world of power, silence is often the sharpest rejection. One unanswered email could mean nothing, or it could mean I had been blacklisted, my name whispered among circles as someone to avoid. That risk sat heavy in my chest, but so did something else. The memory of every late night I had carried their concerns when he had brushed them aside. I opened my laptop, staring at the blank email screen. My cursor blinked like a heartbeat, daring me to take the leap. I must have drafted a dozen versions before I found the courage to press send. Some were too formal, some too desperate, some too vague. Finally, I wrote from the only place that felt honest. The truth. I reminded them of conversations we'd had, the small details I had remembered about their families or their businesses. I acknowledged their concerns, the ones I had overheard but never dared to address back then. And most importantly, I positioned myself not as someone trying to attack him, but as someone who wanted to protect what they had invested so much into. Still, as I hovered over the send button, doubt screamed inside me. What if they forward this to him? What if I end up not only humiliated but legally crushed? What if this ends before it even begins? My finger trembled, sweat gathering at the back of my neck. But then I thought of my mother's cracked hands, the way she had always told me that silence only serves those who want you to stay small. And with that, I clicked send. The email whooshed into the void, and immediately, regret crashed over me. My heart pounded as though I had unleashed a storm I couldn't control. I slammed my laptop shut, pacing the room as though movement could silence the panic rising in my throat. Every tick of the clock echoed like judgment. Hours passed, then a day, then another with no reply. I told myself it was over, that I had been foolish to believe I could step into a world built for the powerful. But courage, I realized, isn't measured by instant results. It's measured by the act itself, the act of daring to raise your voice when everything in the world tells you to stay quiet. Even in the silence of those first days, I felt stronger than I had when I worked under him. Because for once, I wasn't just surviving. I was fighting. Then came the night that changed everything. My phone buzzed just past midnight, the screen lighting up in the darkness of my small apartment. It was a reply. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it. One of the investors, one of the very men I had feared most, had written back. His words were brief, but they carried more power than anything I had read in years. Hours later, I got a reply that set the stage for everything to come. Sometimes people listen not because of your title, but because of your truth. That truth became my only weapon the night I finally heard a voice on the other end of the line. One of the very investors whose faith had once been the pillar of my former boss's empire. My palms were slick with sweat as I clutched the phone, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it might drown out my words. "Why are you contacting me?" he asked, his tone clipped, cautious. I could almost see him narrowing his eyes, already wondering if he had made a mistake picking up. For a second, my courage faltered. I wasn't a CEO, not even a manager. I was just the assistant who had been thrown out like trash. What right did I have to speak to him? But then I reminded myself. Titles were illusions. Knowledge was real, and I carried more knowledge than my boss ever realized. I know I don't have the title or the position, I began, forcing my voice to stay steady. But I worked behind the curtain. I saw the details others missed, the cracks he ignored. And I think you already know some of those cracks are widening. There was a long silence on the other end. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might hang up. Then, he said quietly, "Go on." Those two words lit a fire in me. I began to speak, not with the desperation of someone begging to be heard, but with the clarity of someone who had lived every late night, every tense meeting, every mistake swept under the rug. I told him about the reports I had compiled that my boss had altered before sending out. I explained how budgets were inflated to hide losses, how deals were rushed without due diligence, how investor concerns were brushed aside with empty reassurances. At first, his questions were sharp, skeptical. How do you know this? Why should I believe you? Each one felt like a knife testing the strength of my armor. But I answered calmly, reminding him of specific conversations he had once had with my boss. Conversations where I had been present, quietly taking notes, invisible but listening. I referenced details no outsider could have known. The way he had scoffed at their concerns about cash burn, the mocking tone he had used when describing their hesitations, even the promises he made at dinners that were never fulfilled. With each revelation, I could hear his breathing change. At one point, he interrupted me, his voice low and disbelieving. "You mean to tell me he knew, and he lied?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Not only did he know, but he thought you'd never question him. He thought his charm and his arrogance were enough to keep you silent. But I also know you're not blind. You've seen the numbers. You've felt the unease. I'm just confirming what you've already suspected." The line went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, not dismissive, stunned. Finally he spoke, his voice slower, heavier. "You realize what you're doing, don't you? Speaking to me like this could cost you everything." I swallowed hard. I already lost everything. When he fired me, I thought it was the end. But now I see it was just the beginning. I don't want revenge. I want the truth to matter again. And I think you do too. The weight of those words hung between us. I could feel his walls lowering, just enough for me to slip through. I went on, telling him about the countless nights I had pieced together reports while my boss drank himself into confidence, about the board members who whispered doubts when they thought no one else was listening, about the employees who lived in fear of speaking up. By the time I finished, I realized something astonishing. He was no longer questioning me. He was listening, truly listening. "Do the others know what you've told me?" he asked. "No," I admitted, "but they will, because I know the truth won't stay buried forever, and I'd rather be the one to bring it to light than watch him drag you all down with him." For the first time, I heard something in his voice that startled me. Respect. It was cautious, unspoken, but it was there. Then, just as hope began to swell in my chest, he asked the one question I had been dreading, the one that could decide my fate in seconds. But then came the question that could decide my fate in seconds. Trust isn't given. It's built brick by brick, story by story. After that first call, I realized I had crossed an invisible line. There was no turning back. I had stepped into a world where one wrong word could destroy me, but also where truth had the power to reshape everything. And if I was going to survive in this world, I needed more than one investor's ear. I needed their trust, all of them, brick by brick. The first man I spoke to had been skeptical, but once he realized how much I knew, how deeply I had been woven into the company's heartbeat, he agreed to meet me again. That meeting wasn't held in a boardroom or a glittering office. It was in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, far from the skyscrapers and glass towers where appearances mattered. I wore my best shirt, still a little worn at the cuffs, but I walked in with my back straight. When I began to talk, I didn't give him a rehearsed speech. I told him the truth, raw and unpolished. I spoke about what I had seen, what I feared would happen if things didn't change, and the vision I carried for how the company could be saved. Not with arrogance, but with care, precision, and a respect for the people who had invested their faith and money. Something happened in that conversation that surprised me. He leaned in. He listened, not as a man indulging a former assistant, but as an equal, someone who recognized that knowledge and sincerity carry more weight than titles. By the time we parted, his handshake lingered longer than before. "You may be right," he said quietly. "And if you are, we'll all need to start paying attention." That was the first brick. Word began to spread. Quietly, carefully, I reached out to more investors. Some were hesitant to meet. Others dismissed me at first, their voices dripping with skepticism. "Why should I waste my time on you?" But every time I went back to the same thing: truth. I didn't promise miracles. I didn't exaggerate. I showed them numbers, patterns, and memories. I reminded them of the doubts they had whispered, but never voiced aloud. And slowly, their skepticism turned into curiosity. Curiosity turned into conversation, and conversation turned into trust. With each meeting, I grew bolder. I no longer felt like the trembling assistant who had once carried files into their offices. I felt like someone who had finally found his voice, someone who could stand toe-to-toe with men and women who had once towered above me. My passion became my armor. My vision became my weapon. I wasn't just pointing out the CEO's flaws anymore. I was offering solutions. I told them how we could cut waste, rebuild transparency, and rebuild relationships the CEO had burned. I painted a picture of a company not weighed down by one man's ego, but lifted by collaboration, innovation, and respect. And they listened. More than that, they began to respect me. I could see it in their eyes, in the way their posture shifted during our meetings. At first, they looked at me with polite disinterest, the way you look at someone you expect little from. But as I spoke, their gazes sharpened, their arms uncrossed, their silence became the silence of consideration rather than dismissal. Some even took notes. By the end of those conversations, I was no longer the assistant they had once ignored. I was becoming something else, a voice they trusted. It wasn't easy. There were moments when doubt crept back in, when I stumbled over my words or worried I was overstepping. But every time I faltered, I remembered the night I had seen my mother cry in the kitchen, the humiliation of being laughed at by the CEO, the fear of being discarded like I didn't matter. Those memories hardened me, reminding me that failure wasn't an option. Every word I spoke was more than business. It was survival. As weeks turned into months, I built relationships I never imagined I could. Investors who once barely remembered my name now called me directly, asking for my thoughts, my analysis. They began comparing what I told them with the CEO's words, and they saw the difference. His speeches were grand, filled with confidence but hollow in substance. Mine were detailed, honest, backed with proof. And it became clearer with each passing day that respect for him was slipping, while respect for me was growing. I remember one evening vividly. I was presenting a set of financial patterns I had pieced together, proof that the CEO had been hiding losses behind inflated projections. I expected anger, denial, maybe even dismissal. Instead, the room grew quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy with realization. Then one investor, an older man with sharp eyes, leaned back in his chair and said, "You've shown us more in one evening than he has in years." Those words struck me harder than any insult the CEO had ever thrown at me, because in that moment I realized I had crossed another invisible line. I was no longer just whispering doubts. I was shaping opinions. I was shifting power. Brick by brick, story by story, I had built a foundation of trust. And just when I thought it couldn't grow stronger, something happened that I hadn't dared to hope for. After one particularly intense meeting, when I had laid out both the risks of continuing down the CEO's path and the possibilities of change, one of the investors leaned forward. His eyes locked onto mine, sharp but thoughtful. "You've been telling us what he's doing wrong," he said. "But let me ask you something. What would you do if you were in charge?" The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned to me. My heart pounded as I realized this was no longer just about exposing his failures. This was about proving my worth as a leader, until one of them made me an offer I couldn't ignore. Walking back into the office I was fired from felt like stepping onto a battlefield. Every step echoed like a drumbeat, each one carrying the weight of humiliation I had once suffered there, and the fire of the man I had become since. I remembered vividly the day I left, head low, dignity stripped, feeling like a discarded shadow. And now, as the investors guided me through the gleaming glass doors, I returned not as an assistant, but as something far more dangerous. The man they trusted more than him. The building hadn't changed. The polished marble floors still gleamed. The receptionist still smiled with professional detachment. The walls still hummed with the low rhythm of corporate life. But I had changed. I wasn't the trembling figure carrying folders in silence anymore. My back was straight, my chin lifted, and my eyes steady with purpose. And yet, beneath that calm, my heart thundered. Because this wasn't just a visit. This was war, and the boardroom was about to become my battleground. The investors had arranged a surprise meeting. To him, it would look like business as usual, a gathering of allies to discuss strategy. But as I followed them down the long hallway towards the boardroom, I felt the tension in the air sharpen. Whispers followed us, employees glancing curiously at the unfamiliar sight of me walking alongside men who had once ignored my presence. Their eyes widened, their steps slowed, and I could almost hear their thoughts. Why is he back? And why with them? When the heavy boardroom doors opened, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The room was as I remembered. A long mahogany table, chairs lined with precision, walls adorned with framed accolades meant to remind everyone of his genius. At the head of the table sat the CEO, my former boss, exuding his usual air of confidence. His suit was immaculate, his watch gleamed under the lights, and his smirk was already forming as he greeted the investors. But then his eyes landed on me. The smirk froze. For a long, charged moment, he didn't move. His eyes widened, his jaw tightened, and though he tried to mask it, the shock was written across his face. He wasn't prepared to see me. Not here, not like this. I could almost hear the thoughts racing in his head. The disbelief that the assistant he had tossed aside was now walking into his sanctuary, flanked by the very men who kept his empire afloat. "What is he doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended, betraying the crack in his composure. The investors didn't flinch. One of them replied coolly, "He's here because we want him here. We thought it was time you both sat at the same table." The words hung in the air like a gavel striking down judgment. I took my seat, not at the edge of the table where assistants belonged, but halfway down, directly across from him. My hands rested calmly on the wood, though inside adrenaline surged through me. I could feel his glare trying to burn holes into me, but I refused to look away. For the first time, we were eye to eye, not boss and subordinate, but adversaries on equal ground. The meeting began, and the tension was suffocating. He launched into his usual performance, grand speeches, exaggerated confidence, dismissing concerns with the arrogance of a man who had always believed himself untouchable. But as he spoke, I saw the investors' faces. Their eyes didn't shine with admiration. They flickered toward me, waiting, comparing, weighing. And then my turn came. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't grandstand. I simply laid out the facts. The numbers, the risks, the cracks hidden beneath his illusions. I spoke of solutions, of rebuilding trust, of a vision that placed the company's survival above ego. My words weren't polished with arrogance, but with sincerity and precision. Every sentence drew from the years I had spent in the shadows, learning every weakness of his empire. As I spoke, I saw it. The shift. The investors leaned toward me, their pens moving, their nods subtle but unmistakable. One by one, their respect pivoted from him to me. And he saw it, too. His jaw clenched, his fists tightened, his smirk long gone. He interrupted me twice, his tone desperate, but each time the investors silenced him with a glance, urging me to continue. The humiliation that once belonged to me was now his. By the time I finished, the air in the room was different. He looked at them for reassurance, but they didn't meet his gaze. They looked at me. The man he had laughed at, belittled, discarded, was now the man holding their attention, their trust, their respect. His face turned pale, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before. Fear. He had no idea control was about to slip right out of his hands. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room is silence. And it wasn't his anymore. For years, his arrogance had dominated every boardroom. He filled the air with booming confidence, quick dismissals, and the sheer weight of a personality that bulldozed opposition into silence. But on this day, seated across from him at the long mahogany table, I realized something had shifted. His voice hadn't grown softer. It was the room that had stopped listening. The meeting began with the usual rhythm. He leaned back in his chair, spun his pen casually between his fingers, and began listing his latest accomplishments. But the investors didn't nod along this time. They didn't scribble notes or murmur approval. They sat still, their gazes cool and unreadable. Their silence cut deeper than any argument, and he felt it. I saw the flicker in his eyes, the way his smirk faltered when no one rushed to validate his words. Then the questions began. "Where is the revenue you promised last quarter?" one investor asked, his tone sharp. "You told us the losses were temporary," another pressed. "But they've only grown." "And these partnerships you spoke of," a third added, "they don't exist, do they?" Each question landed like a strike. For years he had deflected with charm, with bluster, with the audacity of a man who believed his charisma could blind anyone. But now, the investors weren't blinded anymore. They saw the cracks. They had heard my words, reviewed my evidence, and felt the weight of truth pressing down. He shifted uncomfortably, his casual demeanor crumbling. "These things take time," he snapped. "You can't expect results overnight." But the room didn't soften. Silence answered him again, heavier this time. I sat quietly, hands folded, my eyes steady, my presence calm. And it was that calmness, I realized, that unnerved him most. For years, I had been the silent one in the corner, invisible. Now, silence itself was my power. The investors pressed harder. "Why did you misrepresent the numbers in last month's report?" His face flushed. "I didn't misrepresent anything. I simplified for clarity." "Clarity," the investor shot back. "Or deception." His jaw tightened, his fist slamming onto the table with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. "I built this company. Without me, none of you would be here. And you sit there questioning me, while you hang on to the words of someone who doesn't even belong at this table?" His glare snapped toward me, his voice dripping with venom. "Him. That's who you're listening to? My assistant?" For a moment, the room went still. Every eye turned to me. And in that silence, I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply met their gaze with steady resolve. I didn't need to defend myself. My presence here was proof enough. That was the moment he lost the room. Investors shifted in their chairs, some leaning toward me, others shaking their heads at him. One of them spoke what everyone was thinking. "Respect is earned, not demanded. And right now, your defensiveness speaks louder than your results." His face twisted with anger, the mask of control slipping. He had always prided himself on composure, but now his voice cracked with desperation. "You're making a mistake. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's nothing without me." But those words were the nail in his coffin. Because everyone in that room knew it wasn't true. I had spoken with facts, with clarity, with humility. He had spoken with arrogance, with rage, with fear. And in that contrast, the truth was undeniable. I stayed silent, letting the weight of his outburst hang in the air. The investors exchanged glances, their expressions grim, their patience gone. They had seen enough. And though he didn't realize it yet, his reign was already slipping through his fingers. Then, in a desperate attempt to regain control, he made a mistake so big it ended his reign. And then he made a mistake so big it ended his reign. The higher a man builds his ego, the harder the fall when it shatters. I had seen glimpses of his arrogance cracking before, but never like this. In that boardroom, surrounded by the very investors who once worshipped him, the mask slipped completely. The man who had always seemed untouchable, always so calculated and commanding, now stood exposed, grasping at the last straws of authority. His voice rose, desperate and sharp, as he pointed at me across the polished mahogany table. "You're being manipulated," he shouted. "This boy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's feeding you lies because he wants revenge. Do you not see it? He's nothing more than a bitter assistant who couldn't handle the job." The words echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls like accusations hurled into a void. For a moment, I felt that old sting, the familiar humiliation of being belittled, the memory of the day he fired me without warning. But this time, the weight of his insult didn't crush me, because the investors weren't nodding in agreement anymore. They weren't laughing at his dismissal of me. They were watching him unravel. One of the investors leaned back, his expression cold. "We've seen the numbers ourselves. He's only confirmed what we already suspected." Another added, "You've hidden losses, exaggerated projections, and dismissed concerns for too long. This isn't about him. It's about your failure." His face flushed deep red, his hands trembling as he slammed a fist on the table. "I built this company," he roared. "Without me, none of you would have anything. You sit here in judgment, but you wouldn't last a day without my vision." But his words rang hollow now. The same speeches that once commanded loyalty now sounded like the cries of a man cornered, stripped of his power. The investors didn't soften. Their eyes were hard, their silence unforgiving. One by one, they withdrew from him, their posture shifting subtly toward me, as though the gravitational pull of the room had changed. For the first time, I saw it in his eyes. Fear. Genuine, bone-deep fear. The realization that his empire wasn't built on strength, but on borrowed faith, and that faith was crumbling. He turned back to me, his voice dropping, almost pleading. "You think you're clever? You think you know this business better than I do? You don't. You'll never be me." I held his gaze steadily, not with arrogance, but with calm. I didn't need to respond. The investor's silence answered for me. The truth was undeniable. He was no longer the man they trusted. His words, once weapons, had turned into ashes in his mouth. The outburst dragged on, each sentence more frantic than the last. He accused, he shouted, he tried to intimidate, but the more he spoke, the clearer it became that he was unraveling. His arrogance had once shielded him, but now it betrayed him. Every sneer, every insult, every desperate attempt to discredit me only highlighted the contrast, his chaos against my calm. Finally, one of the senior investors spoke, his voice low but cutting. "This isn't leadership. This is desperation." The CEO froze, his chest heaving, his eyes darting between them, searching for even one ally. But there were none left. The men and women who had once cheered his boldness now looked at him as though he were already history, a relic of a past they wanted no part of. And then came the moment I'll never forget. He sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping, the fire in his eyes dimming as reality sank in. For the first time, the great man who had seemed larger than life looked small, fragile, broken. He realized, in that instant, that he was losing everything, not because of me, but because of himself. The silence in the room was heavy, charged, final. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest, the shift in power settling like dust after an explosion. And then, slowly, every pair of eyes turned toward me. And then, they turned to me with a life-changing decision. Revenge fades, but justice lingers forever. That truth crystallized the moment every pair of eyes in that boardroom shifted toward me. The silence was thick, the kind that bends time, stretching each second until it feels eternal. I sat there, my palms flat against the polished table, my heart thundering in my chest as the weight of their gazes pressed into me. And then one of the senior investors, his voice measured but firm, broke the silence. "We've seen what he has to offer," he said, nodding toward the CEO slumped at the head of the table. "And we've seen what you bring. The truth, the knowledge, the vision. It's time we start listening to the right person." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words rang louder than any applause, louder than any insult I'd endured, louder than the CEO's voice had ever been. They weren't just questioning him anymore. They were considering me. At first, I thought I had misheard. But then another voice joined in, calm and resolute. "You've shown us more clarity in weeks than he has in years. You've earned a seat at this table." A third added, "The company needs new leadership, fresh vision, someone we can trust." I felt the air shift, the tide turning completely. And then came the words that changed everything. "We'd like to offer you a leadership role, a partnership, not as an assistant, not as a shadow, but as an equal." The room spun around me, my throat tightened, my hands trembling ever so slightly under the table. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the quiet of my apartment, in the nights when doubt clawed at me, in the mornings when I forced myself to believe I was worth more than the world insisted. But imagination could never prepare me for the reality. Across from me, he sat in silence. The man who once fired me without warning, who had mocked me, belittled me, discarded me, now stared at me with eyes hollow and stunned. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. For once he had no weapon, no arrogance, no shield. He was powerless. And in that silence, I saw the depth of his defeat. I should have felt triumph, the sweetness of revenge, the thrill of standing over the man who had once crushed me. But what I felt instead was something deeper, steadier, justice. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about proving, not to him, but to myself, that I had always been more than what he saw, that I had value, vision, and strength no one could erase. I lifted my chin, my voice steady as I answered. "If I accept, it won't be for power. It won't be for recognition. It will be for the company, for the people who believed in me when I had nothing, and for those who still believe in the truth." The investors nodded, satisfaction flickering in their eyes. They weren't just giving me a role. They were entrusting me with the future. And I realized then that this wasn't the end of my journey, but the beginning of something far greater. I glanced once more at him. His shoulders slumped, his eyes dark, his silence louder than any outburst he could have made. He had built his empire on arrogance, but in the end it was arrogance that destroyed him. And now he had to watch as the person he once dismissed as irrelevant took the very place he had sworn I would never deserve. As I sat in that room, no longer invisible, no longer powerless, I reflected on how far I had come. From the day I walked out of this building in shame, to the nights I stared at a blank email screen with trembling hands, to the first investor who finally listened, I had climbed back, one step at a time. And in that climb, I discovered something he never had: resilience. Because resilience is born in fire. It's born in rejection, in humiliation, in the nights when the world laughs at you and you have no choice but to keep going anyway. It's born in the silence of being underestimated, in the pain of being discarded. And when resilience finally rises, it cannot be destroyed. That day, I didn't just gain a seat at the table, I gained proof. Proof that your worth is not defined by someone else's arrogance. Proof that even when the world writes you off, you can write yourself back into the story. Proof that sometimes, the very fire meant to burn you down becomes the fire that forges you into steel. And as the meeting ended, as the investors filed out with new resolve, I lingered in the boardroom for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle in. My eyes drifted to the head of the table, the seat that once symbolized power beyond my reach. He sat there still, silent, broken. And for the first time, I didn't look at him with anger or hatred. I looked at him with clarity. His downfall wasn't my victory. It was his own doing. My victory was survival. My victory was return. My victory was justice. Because sometimes, the one they throw away returns as the one they can't replace. If this story inspired you, don't just scroll away. Hit that like button and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated the way I was? Share your experience. I read every single one. And if you want more stories of resilience, revenge, and redemption, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss what's coming next.